Hello, Mystorians. Today we have the stories of two messy prostitutes from the past. One from the 1700s and the other from the Gilded Age. One of them was the first woman to become famous for being famous. She lived fast and died young. The other one became very rich by selling herself and other women. She was a madam who died broke because by the end of her life, she only knew how to make money illegally. Each one had a life that was a hot mess and proved that there's no business like hoe business. Meet Kitty Fisher and Lulu White. There was a time when celebrity described a person who was celebrated for his or her works, whether those works included acting, singing, or dancing, or a combination of two of those things, or maybe even all three. In Hollywood's golden age, a person who could do all three, act, sing, and dance, was called a triple threat. The day of the triple threat is virtually over. Some would even argue that it's hard to find a celebrity who performs one talent well. That's subjective. But there's another kind of celebrity that we see plenty of today. Celebrities who have no discernible talent at all. People who are just famous for being famous. Maybe they are women who are pretty, or men who are handsome, or people with rich parents, or people married to someone who is famous, or related to someone who is famous. This social media age makes it easy to get one's name on the map. Well, before all of this, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter with their verified check marks that let you know that the person you are interacting with is a celebrity, there were newspapers. And before anyone named Kardashian or Jenner or Hilton or Harvey or LaToya Jackson or Kevin Federline rode the coattails of their family name to stardom, a girl named Kitty Fisher created her own fame and fortune using the newspapers of London's Fleet Street. And she did it by sharing the details of the sexual affairs that she had with wealthy men of the city. And what an amazing fortune she gained from it all. Let's get into it. But first, if you like these videos about the most scandalous people from yesteryear who make Ty's Hot Mess History channel a time capsule for the culture, subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can know every time that I upload one of these videos or every time that I live stream. And comment "I subscribed" in the comment section so that I can say hello to you. Now, on to why you are here. There are so many people around today who are famous just for being famous. You know who they are, and you probably wouldn't have to think too hard to come up with 5 names who fit into this category. They're not actors, singers, or comedians. Sometimes they are called socialites, or maybe even Instagram models or influencers. They are people who use their money to make an impression on the public. That money might be accompanied by salacious rumors or even sex tapes, anything to get their name in the news or the blogs. The whole idea of this manufactured fame seems like a relatively new phenomenon, but it's not. As far back as the 18th century, the newspapers were just as fascinated with scandalous stories as social media is today. And the more scandalous the stories were, the better. And British newspapers liked to get straight to the heart of the scandals, so they loved to print stories about the most scandalous women, prostitutes. The London writers knew who the prostitutes were, and they frequently used them as sources for their stories. And the more vulgar a prostitute was, the better, for she would have the best stories, and those stories sold newspapers. These days, people make jokes about hoe culture and how hoes are coming up and hoes are staying on top. And even this is nothing new. In the 1700s, the whores whose stories were printed the most also had books published and prints were made of their portraits. Those prints could easily sell by the hundreds or the thousands. And according to several sources, Kitty Fisher was the prostitute who paved the way for the other prostitutes of her age to earn some major side cash that would supplement, and in some instances even surpass, the earnings that they made from selling their cooches. Kitty started prostituting when she was a teenager in the late 1750s. Straight away, she got the attention of a lot of men because she was deemed to be beautiful. It didn't take long for prominent artists on the London scene to take notice of her, and they wanted to paint her portrait, and Kitty let them. Her prints spread throughout the local gentry, or upper class, with the greatest ease. But Kitty was more than just a pretty face and a good time for men willing to pay for her services. She had a natural knack for publicity. So the stories of her affairs with men of means spread as far and wide as her legs. And not only did men want to be with her, women wanted to be her. Women who wanted to get the sexual attention of men would style themselves after Kitty, from the way that she wore her makeup and hair to the way that she dressed. She was a trendsetter. In the 1700s, it was a common practice for high-class hookers to do their own PR. Some were better than others, but it seems that Kitty was the best. She knew how to draw men in with her advertisements by letting them know that she would stimulate their bodies and their minds because she was skilled at conversation. That set her apart from other prostitutes and gave her favor in the eyes of wealthier clients. And it was via those wealthy clients that she rose up through the ranks. As her client list became more upper class, so did she, which was quite a feat at that time in London, a city that looked down on anyone who even tried to social climb. But it worked for Kitty. She used each wealthy client as a stepping stone to get to an even wealthier one, increasing her own wealth with each step. But I suppose that you can't win them all. When the famous Italian lover, Casanova, yes, that Casanova, met Kitty while on holiday in England, he didn't seem to be too impressed by her. This is what he wrote of their encounter. Quote, "The illustrious Kitty Fisher, who was just beginning to be fashionable. She was magnificently dressed, and it is no exaggeration to say that she had on diamonds worth 500,000 francs. Godard told me that if I liked, I might have her then and there for 10 guineas. I did not care to do so, however, for, though charming, she could only speak English, and I like to have all my senses, including that of my hearing, gratified." End quote. And just for the record, in addition to having her stories and advertisements printed in the papers, the other form of media that Kitty was taking advantage of was paintings. Kitty would sit with any artist who wanted to paint her, even rival artists. And in the 1700s, prints of paintings were reproduced in all sizes and sometimes different shapes. This allowed Kitty to have a lot of distributable media to keep her image on the minds of men. She was basically the first pin-up girl. Her image could have been plastered on a wall or hidden away in a snuff box or on the inside of a locket. She was flat out famous, or infamous depending on who you ask. There was a popular nursery rhyme about Kitty stealing the lovers of other prostitutes. And then there was Kitty's very public falling out with Maria Lady Coventry. Now, who the heck was Maria Lady Coventry? She was a countess of London's high society who would throw fabulous balls. Much the opposite of Kitty, who was a hooker and therefore had a different affiliation with balls, namely Maria's husband's balls. And who was Maria Lady Coventry's husband? George Coventry, the 6th Earl of Coventry. All that really matters about him for the sake of this story is that he was born into money and with a title. So here's how that story goes about Kitty's public spat with his wife. Picture it. London, 1750-something. In the park, Kitty is walking, looking fabulous in one of her custom-made dresses. Lady Coventry sees her, admires her beautiful dress, and asks, "Will you please tell me the name of your dressmaker who made this dress? It is beautiful." To which Kitty replies, "I wish that I could tell you, but I can't, because it was a gift. But I know who you can't ask. The person who gave it to me, Lord Coventry, you know, your husband." To which Maria replied, "Well, I never." To which Kitty replied, "Well, I have, with your husband over and over and over and over. Now, I might be paraphrasing a little bit, but that really was the gist of it. At some point, the Countess called Kitty an impertinent woman. And Kitty replied something to this effect. I will have to accept this insult because you are socially superior to me since marrying Lord Coventry, but I will marry a lord one day, just so that I can answer back to you. Well, Kitty may not have come out looking the best in this story, but she made sure that it hit the papers. At the very least, people would know that she was hanging out in the right circles, even if it meant that a countess was talking down to her. Kitty had a way of flipping embarrassing situations to work in her benefit in a positive and profitable way. She became so wealthy from her rich clients and her publicity about them that she was able to totally change her life and her socioeconomic status. She started out as a poor, pretty prostitute, but before her life was over, Kitty was able to spend £12,000 per year. That's equivalent to the purchasing power of over £3 million today in 2022. She was also said to be the first woman born into her low social class who eventually was able to employ liveried servants. And that just means servants in uniform, with each servant having a uniform that is specific for his or her position. Think of Downton Abbey as a reference. And that wealthy husband who Kitty wanted so that she could go back to the Countess and tell her off? She got him. Her rapid rise through the upper echelons of London society put her in the way of John Norris, Member of Parliament for Rye. He married her in 1766 at his family's house, Hempstead in the village of Benenden in Kent. And it seems like the two could possibly have been using each other. You see, Kitty's wealth was on the way up, and her husband's was on the way down. So, she devoted her life to building up his dilapidated fortunes, all the while getting to be looked at as a more respectable woman, and finally seen as a well-regarded and welcomed member in society. In return, John got the use of Kitty's money and a wife who was young and beautiful. In her time as John Norris's wife, Kitty also became known for her philanthropic efforts and generosity to the needy. They say that it's not about how you start, but how you finish. And it seems like the girl whose job it was to give happy endings ended up living a happy ending for herself, even if that ending seemed to come too soon. Yes, unfortunately, Kitty didn't get to enjoy being a high society woman for too long. Only 4 months after her wedding, she died in March of 1767 at the age of 26. Her exact cause of death is not known, but the 3 suggestions are that she either died of smallpox, consumption, or from the effects of lead-based cosmetics. If the last suggestion is the correct one, that Kitty died from cosmetics poisoning, that would be quite a coincidence, because her adversary from the park, who wanted to know about her dressmaker, the Countess, died the same way. Kitty died at the age of 26, and the Countess died at the age of 27. The lead-based makeup that the ladies were using was called Venetian ceruse, and it was used to make the skin as white as possible, literally the way that we think of clown makeup today. That was fashionable in the 1700s. Possibly the most famous person who most of us know of who used this makeup was Queen Elizabeth I. It seemed to make her beautiful until it started to literally eat away at her skin and cause her to lose hair. By the time that she was in her last days, she had to wear the lead-based poisoning an inch thick just to cover the holes in her face. The same was likely true for Kitty and the Countess in our story. But even though Kitty's beauty regimen is likely what caused her demise, she still went out in true Kitty Fisher fashion, for her last dying wish was to be buried in her best ball gown. And her wish was granted. She was buried on her husband's estate in Benenden Churchyard, which is now the premises of Benenden School, an independent boarding school for girls in Kent, England. There was another prostitute who made a great fortune in her day on this side of the pond in New Orleans, Lulu White. Lulu White was one of the most notorious madams of the 1890s and early 1900s. According to every source I have seen, she was born in Selma, Alabama in 1868, but she liked to lie about her origins. She would claim to be from Jamaica sometimes. Other times she would claim to be from Cuba. It seems that her goal was to create an aura of exoticism about herself. And the reason? To attract wealthy white men to herself and her girls, who were her prostitutes. If they seemed like they were more than just prostitutes from New Orleans, but instead well-born, well-educated, and charming young women from exotic places, a higher price could be charged for their services. Lulu White had several run-ins with the law in her time for a multitude of things, including attempted murder and selling alcohol. But let's be very clear. She made her fortune selling sex, and she came up with some very innovative ways to do her job. Lulu White was born Lulu Henley in 1868 in Selma, Alabama. Many of the details about her early years are vague, and it seems that that's the way she wanted it. When she knew that sex work was going to be her chosen path, she began a process of reinventing herself. So, rather than admit that she was from plain old Selma, Alabama, she began to tell people that she was from Jamaica or Cuba. At some point in the early 1880s, Lulu moved to New Orleans and started working as a prostitute. So, if her birth year of 1868 is correct, she could have been prostituting as early as 12 or 13 years old. She first appears in the New Orleans City Directory in 1888, in a neighborhood comprised of colored female boarding houses and brothels. She made a series of pornographic photos either in the 1880s or early 1890s, perhaps for financial gain or increased publicity or both. And by the early 1890s, she was already a madam, running her own whorehouse. They say that timing is everything, and this was the case for Lulu White's success in the sex work industry. Throughout the existence of New Orleans, prostitution had been tolerated and even accepted. But at the end of the 1800s, there was a social purity movement happening in the United States that even the city of New Orleans could not escape, despite its history of being a place where one could enjoy many vices. Parts of this social purity movement included restricting and even outlawing prostitution. The man pushing the purity movement in New Orleans was Sidney Story. He was an alderman who, in 1897, introduced an ordinance to limit prostitution to a 10-square-block district in the city's 4th Ward. He was successful in getting his ordinance to pass, bringing a semblance of conservative traditional values to his sinful city. He had to have been proud of himself. He was probably also shocked when the local New Orleans newspapers named the new red light district after him. He was Sidney Story. They called the vice district Storyville, forever attaching his name to the prostitutes he wanted to shut down. Typically, thoughts of prostitution are accompanied by thoughts of low rent, crime, and bad neighborhoods. But the property values increased after Storyville was named a red light district because of the clientele who was to be entertained there, elite and wealthy white men. They proved to be very big spenders, and they were coming from all over the country. Before this area became the red light district known as Storyville, it was a mostly black neighborhood full of working class people. After it became Storyville, things changed. Let's just say that gentrification is nothing new. rents in Storyville increased as much as 1,500%. So it goes without saying that many of its previous residents had to move out. In addition to participating in the nation's purity movement at the turn of the century, New Orleans was also advertising its warm temperatures and fun activities in an attempt to get a piece of the pie of the winter tourism market. One of the potential excursions that was promoted was the city's prostitution district. Brothels in Storyville could legally only serve white men. The brothels could employ white prostitutes or black ones. However, they were required to be segregated, meaning that one house could employ either white or black prostitutes, but not both. I suppose that what Lulu White was doing was considered something in the middle. Not black prostitutes, not white prostitutes, but she only employed Octoroons. I think that by today's standards, most of us would call Lulu's prostitutes white, but in the 1880s, they were distinctly classified as Octoroons, and though they almost always looked white, they were not allowed to identify as such. Octoroon is a dated and offensive term which describes someone who is 1/8 black by descent, having one black great-grandparent. Again, they look white because they basically are, and these were the girls and women who Lulu employed to work in her beautiful mansion on Basin Street in Storyville. Storyville was a high-rent district, and Lulu had the money that she needed to be a major player in it. She paid $40,000 to have her brothel constructed. That $40,000 has the same buying power of about $1.4 million today in 2022. And when all was said and done, she had a 4-story mansion with a swirling staircase, marble floors, 15 bedrooms, each with their own private baths, 5 parlors, an elevator, ornate chandeliers, luxurious furniture, and walls lined with mirrors. She named her whorehouse Mahogany Hall, a nod to the partially black women who worked there at 235 North Basin Street. Remember, Lulu had been all about selling an image since she had started lying about where she was born. Her whorehouse needed to sell an image as well. It needed to scream that she had money so that she could get even more of it from the rich men who were coming to visit her girls. But it didn't stop there. Of course, Lulu White had her own image to maintain, and it needed to match the splendor of her mansion. She would often wear a bright red wig, a tiara, diamonds on every finger, and bracelets that went halfway up her arms. Lulu White was selling a racial fantasy to her wealthy white clients. Inherent in cultural categorizations like mulatto, quadroon, and octoroon was the assumption that though octoroon women, being the whitest of all of them, possessed the socially desirable looks of whiteness, they also inherited the savagery, depravity, and sexual desires falsely ascribed to black women. So that tiny bit of blackness is what made them exciting as sexual partners. That tiny bit of blackness is what made them taboo. That tiny bit of blackness made Octoroons the epitome of sexual objects. To be in step with the entire fantasy, Lulu's house had to look the part. She had to look the part. Her girls had to look the part. And she figured that with Octoroons, she couldn't lose. She named Mahogany Hall an Octoroon parlor, and she was thus labeled the Queen of the Octoroons. She took her business very seriously. At Mahogany Hall, you didn't just come in to pick a girl and get it on. Lulu produced and published a souvenir guide that had photos and written profiles of her prostitutes. Her guidebook described Mahogany Hall as a place where a man could enjoy 3 shots for his money: the shot upstairs, the shot downstairs, and the shot in the room. Of course, Lulu is profiled in her book, Continuing with the lies about herself, she called herself a famous West Indian Octoroon. She also described herself as someone who knew her business, writing, quote, "It did not take long for her to find out what the other sex were in search of," end quote. Here's what she had to say about her workers. Quote, "She has made a feature of boarding none but the fairest of girls, those gifted with nature's best charms, and would under no circumstances have any but that class in her house," end quote. And as for the photograph used for Lulu's profile, it was apparently a picture of another one of Lulu's prostitutes who was also featured in her guidebook, Victoria Hall. So Lulu's profile was just another piece of evidence that showed how she lived her life, some fact mixed in with some fiction. Perhaps she'd be an Instagram quote-unquote model if she were alive today. Lulu produced a souvenir guidebook specifically for her brothel, but there was a well-known guide called the Blue Book that listed all of the whorehouses as well as the individual whores of Storyville. It was published annually, and it was basically like a yellow pages for prostitution. Business owners would pay the Blue Book to advertise products that its readers might want or need, like liquor, cigars, and cures for sexually transmitted diseases. Here is one of Lulu's listings in the Red Book, a publication that had basically the same information about the brothels of Storyville as the Blue Book, and it was the Blue Book's main competition. A full page for her house on the left. On the right, the numbers 235 for Lulu indicate the address. The street name is on the top of the page, so readers would know to visit 235 North Basin Street if they wanted to see Lulu or any of her girls listed there, Annie, Emma, Irene, or Corin. Like the other upscale whorehouses in Storyville, Lulu's offered more than just sex. Some of the clients wanted live entertainment, dancing, and music. And at the time when jazz music was still trying to figure out what it was, Joe King Oliver played at Mahogany Hall. He was Louis Armstrong's mentor. One thing that should be made clear about Lulu White and Octoroons of her time is that, given the opportunity to identify as just white, they would have. Lulu tried to, at least on one occasion when she visited a segregated racetrack. She was refused entry because she tried to enter as a white person. A local newspaper reported that, quote, "Some people take her to be colored, but she says there is not a drop of Negro blood in her veins. She says that she is West Indian and she was born in the West Indies," end quote. I wonder if Lulu had any idea just how many black people were in the West Indies when she made that statement. Anyhow, the point is that she played up the Octoroon image to get money. Since she was stuck with the label, she found a way to make it pay for her pain. She turned something bad into something good. But all good things must come to an end, and Storyville is no exception to the rule. 20 years after the red light district was established, there was mounting pressure to shut it down. Some wanted a full ban on prostitution, but until they could get that, segregation would do. In 1917, legislation was proposed to officially segregate Storyville, forcing out all non-white prostitutes. A number of madams filed lawsuits to retain their properties and won unprecedented legal victories against Jim Crow laws. The final blow against Storyville came from the U.S. Navy when, under President Woodrow Wilson's leadership, America formally entered World War I. There was a naval base in the shadows of Storyville, and anything that could possibly distract soldiers from their duty was considered a threat. That included prostitutes. A federal order prohibited prostitution within 5 miles of any military base. So it ended up being the prominent Navy presence in New Orleans, not segregationists or social purists, that ended Storyville once and for all. Well, even the United States Navy's federal order didn't stop Lulu from trying to continue her sex business as usual. She had previously beat attempted murder charges, so why not take her chance with a little prostitution? After Lulu was arrested for continuing to run her whorehouse, she received a prison sentence of 1 year and 1 day. After serving only 3 months of her sentence, she applied for a pardon, citing poor health, and she was pardoned by President Woodrow Wilson himself. She returned to New Orleans and immediately started running her whorehouse again. You know the saying, there's no business like hoe business. Lulu spent the late 1910s and 1920s being arrested repeatedly on charges of running a disorderly house. She was also arrested for violating the Volstead Act, which is more commonly known as the National Prohibition Act, because she was selling liquor at her saloon that was next to her brothel. Everything that she knew how to do to make money was illegal by the 1920s. So, in 1929, Lulu White sold her magnificent mansion, Mahogany Hall, to the owner of a department store, who was said to have used it for storage. The sale of Mahogany Hall was truly the end of an era, and virtually the end of Lulu White. But thanks to Louis Armstrong, whose mentor played at Mahogany Hall, the house's name was immortalized in song, his song called Mahogany Hall Stomp. Louis Armstrong himself grew up in what was called Uptown Storyville. It was nothing like the seemingly glamorous streets of Storyville, where Lulu's mansion was. It was where those working-class black people were forced to move when the prostitution district took over. It was also where the prostitutes of color relocated to work when segregation hit Storyville. As for Lulu White, after she sold Mahogany Hall in 1929, she tried to play it straight. She invested a good deal of her money into business dealings that turned sour. She lost over $150,000, surely almost all of her fortune, $2.5 million in today's money. In 1931, she died an ill and very poor woman. Almost all of Storyville was demolished in order to build the Iberville housing development that is more commonly called the Iberville Projects. Iberville was completed in 1941 and at the time opened exclusively for white, low-income residents. And where Mahogany Hall once stood in its 4-story splendor, you will find this, Basin Supermarket Seafood and Grill. It is the first floor of Mahogany Hall's adjacent saloon. The top story was destroyed by Hurricane Betsy in 1965. What's on the menu at this location now is nothing like what Lulu White was selling here in her day. But the good news is that now, whenever transactions are completed here, none of the guests will need a cure for a sexually transmitted disease. It was very important to Lulu White that her prostitutes were Octoroons and that their skin was as white as possible. There was a group of people who called themselves the Blue Vein Society, who were very vocal during Lulu's time. Proximity to whiteness was their main focus. I published a story about them that you can see here. I will also leave a link to it in the description box. My sources for these stories are National Trust United Kingdom, historycollection.com, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, 64parishes.org, Caitlin V. Voicey, the Historic New Orleans Collection, New Orleans Public Library, messinessichic.com, loslatidodelJazz.com, The Times Democrat Archives, 1898, 1909, and 1913. This video has been brought to you by me, Well, my Patreon is a sponsor for this video. If you like these dirty scandals on my channel, then you'll love my Patreon, Ty's Too Hot Hot Mess History. It has all of the stuff that I can't talk about or show here because it's just too hot, too violent, too sexual, too graphic, too much. Come and join us there for the hot Hot Mess History. The link is in the description box.